Hello, Internet. Jordan here. The Tyrannosaurus Rex lived closer to the present than to the Stegosaurus. Seriously. The first T-Rexes appeared about 68 million years ago, but by that time, Stegosaurus had already been extinct for almost 80 million years. Why is that so surprising? Why does time ever surprise us? I mean, we all think we understand how time works, but clearly, we don't always. Of course, dinosaurs lived a very long time ago, and longer periods of time can be more difficult to understand. But even when it comes to stretches of time that we think we have a good sense of, we can still get a little bit confused. Let's look at some examples of that. When we think of Abraham Lincoln, we think of someone who lived way, way before any of us. But the last remaining witness to Lincoln's assassination only died in 1956. The last remaining Titanic survivor lived long enough to see Barack Obama become president of the United States. Here's one that involves much shorter stretches of time. This one will be surprising in different ways to different people, and I'll explain why later on. As of 2025, someone in grade 12 was born closer to the World Wide Web being open to the public than to the present. So, why is all of this surprising? Well, I'm going to explain some of the ways we think about time and how those ways can go wrong every now and then. One rule of thumb that we use when we think about time is that when two things are similar, we tend to assume that there wasn't a lot of time in between them. T-Rex and Stegosaurus are both dinosaurs, so we assume that they were alive at around the same time, even though that's not the case. Although it does make sense to assume this. After all, if two things are similar, the time in between them must not have had much going on. And if it didn't have much going on, then it must have been short, right? Well, in some cases that works, but in this case, it misleads us. One other thing that misleads us is that we tend to assume things are older when we weren't alive for them, even if they weren't actually that much older than us. When it comes to the witness to Lincoln's assassination being alive in 56, it's surprising because a lot of people who were alive in 56 are still alive today. Now, that means that even though no individual is old enough to remember Lincoln, a lot of people are old enough to remember someone who does remember Lincoln. And so that makes Lincoln feel a little bit closer to the present than he otherwise would. The survivor of the Titanic living into Obama's presidency is another example of this. There are no survivors from the Titanic still alive today, but one of them was alive a lot more recently than you'd expect. There's another thing, though, that makes us think of Lincoln and the Titanic as being further away than they actually are, and that's how we learn about them. The world wasn't actually black and white 100 years ago, we all know that, but the pictures we have from that time are black and white. This discrepancy between what we know the world looked like and what we see of it today makes it feel even more distant. But it's not just documentation. The way we talk about things in the past also influences how far away they feel. It's easy to think of, say, George Washington as occupying a similar point in history to Abraham Lincoln, but in reality, Lincoln was assassinated 133 years after George Washington was born, and 133 years after Lincoln's assassination, it was the year 1998. The way we talk about history prevents us from truly appreciating timescales like this because, to most of us, Lincoln and Washington are both really old people, and we never stop to think that they're not equally old. But what about that fact about the World Wide Web? As of 2025, someone in grade 12 was born closer to the World Wide Web being open to the public than to the present. Why is this one surprising? I mean, our records of the time when the World Wide Web was released are pretty good, and a lot of people are alive today who were alive back then, so where's the disconnect here? Well, remember how I said that this one is surprising to different people in different ways? A younger person will tend to think of the World Wide Web as something that is old by now. And so they'll be surprised that someone born closer to its release than the present is still in grade 12. But an older person will think of the World Wide Web as something pretty new, and so they'll be surprised that someone born well over a decade after its release is already in grade 12. These opposite views all come down to the biggest factor in how we think about time. Ultimately, our sense of time always comes not from an average human lifespan, but from our own personal lifespans. When you turn 10 years old, a year is 10% of your life. But when you turn 50 years old, a year is only 2% of your life. That's a big reason why time speeds up as we get older, but it also means something else. All else being equal, a 10-year-old will think that pretty much everything is older than a 50-year-old thinks it is, simply because their life, the longest unit of time they have as reference, isn't as long. Something that's 10 years old is as old as a 10-year-old, but only a fifth as old as a 50-year-old. When it comes to things no one remembers anymore, everyone's in the same boat. We can't measure them against our lifespans because none of us were alive when those things happened. But with the World Wide Web and its release to the public, some of us remember it, some of us don't. And that leads to some people being surprised by how old it is, and some people being surprised by how new it is. So that's our perception of time. Just like how an optical illusion is when our sense of sight goes wrong, when our sense of time goes wrong, it's called a temporal illusion. And there are many examples. I've only barely scratched the surface in this video. But the one thing they all have in common is that they are all ultimately based on how a period of time measures up to our own lives. So go tell someone that T-Rex lived closer to us today than to the Stegosaurus and see how they react. Thanks for watching.